Good evening, all, and welcome back to Yale Divinity School. Welcome to this public conversation in the midst of a transformational leadership program featuring Lisa Greenwood, the Reverend Lisa Greenwood, who's the CEO and president of the Texas Methodist Foundation. This is part of a two-day class that's taking place at Yale Divinity School this weekend, and we've begun that class already with a great afternoon together. And that class will continue for all of the day tomorrow, even if it's going to be 0 outside. We're gonna be together and talking about this good work. But we're glad that you online are able to join us for this public conversation. The Reverend Lisa Greenwood is a graduate of Yale Divinity School. She is an ordained elder in the Texas Conference of the United Methodist Church, where she has served faithfully in congregations across Texas for several decades. Really significant congregations like the Highland Park United Methodist Church and the First United Methodist Church in Denton, and in congregations in Commerce and in Richardson, Texas. But for 14 years, she's been engaging broader issues in the lives of Christian community, questions of how it is that communities come together, how strategy is developed, helping clergy and lay leaders develop and discover new ways to steward their communities, to build and to live into God's purpose in their lives. Reverend Greenwood serves now as the president and CEO of the Texas Methodist Foundation, a nationally recognized institution that seeks to empower the church to achieve its God-appointed mission by providing financial and leadership ministries that help build cultures of purpose, generosity, and challenge. We're grateful for that work that you're doing and grateful to you for being with us this weekend. In conversation with Reverend Greenwood this evening is Greg Sterling, the Dean of Yale Divinity School, where he also serves as the Lillian Klaus Professor of New Testament. Thank you for being part of this conversation too, Greg.
Thank you, Bill.
Yeah.
And I will begin by saying thank you to one and all for braving very frigid temperatures at the end of a long week and being with us. And Lisa, especially to you for making your way all the way from Texas to come back to your home educational institution. And I do hope you feel at home here.
I do. It's been so good to be here.
Good.
Yeah.
The first question, just so that everybody knows this a little bit about you, you've made a long journey from the days you were a student here and sat, they will not know this, it used to be a large classroom where you're now sitting. So she sat here as a student, there was a stage up here, and took classes. Tell us a little bit about your journey from here to the position you now hold in one of the largest private endowments, certainly one of the largest in the United Methodist Church or in the Wesleyan tradition, and one of the most important even in our country. So what was that story?
Right. So I left here and went back to what was then the North Texas Conference. I was ordained in the United Methodist Church, and now that conference has changed names. It's the Horizon Texas Conference. But I served churches, as Bill indicated, for 20 years. And I served in youth ministry and as an associate pastor and then a senior pastor, and loved that ministry in so many ways and learned a lot. And also, I think, grew a holy discontent with some of what the church wasn't talking about, and really began to dig deep into some of those conversations, some of it about stewarding resources and generosity, some of it about deepening discipleship and formation, and I think those questions continue, and that led me to a couple of steps. One is that I began doing some work with congregations around their generosity, capital campaigns, but all of that stems from a clarity of mission and purpose, and then moves into the, as you know, into the development of resources, but also really helping people deepen their own faith and their generosity. Loved that work, And then my now predecessor, Tom Locke, who was president of Texas Methodist Foundation, invited me onto the team to head their leadership ministry. And I did that for 10 years, and I am 3.5 years into being president of Texas Methodist Foundation. And a couple of things I would say about we affectionately call TMF, Texas Methodist Foundation. We serve Texas and New Mexico, and we also have a national entity, Wesleyan Impact Partners, that serves nationally. And we do lending for churches. We also do charitable services and philanthropy work. So other folks hold endowments with us, so we hold other people's money. And then we also do learning and innovation work, which is really about helping leaders in the church and also around the edges of the church think about not just what the church needs to be strong today, but long into the future. And so that's kind of a nutshell of what I do and where I am.
And for all of you here, Tom Locke, who's a personal friend, actually came here and spent some time at Yale Divinity School, which he considered transformative in his own life. And he will be very open about that. Yeah. So what do you see as the continuities and the discontinuities between your service as a senior minister or pastor and your role as basically a CEO of a major foundation? And I'm asking that obviously because one of the things we're trying to do is to broaden people's understanding of ministry to include not only serving churches, but serving other entities as well. So how do you see the continuity and where are the discontinuities?
Sure. So I'm going to answer this in a couple of different ways. One is that when we think about the purpose of the Texas Methodist Foundation, and Bill stated it, but the sort of shorthand way to say that is that everything we do is to strengthen the church's mission. And so our client is the mission of the church, not necessarily the institutional structures or even denominational structures of the church, but the mission. And so we're all about helping that mission, that purpose, and that's about helping. I'm not going to use anybody's tagline of any denomination's tagline, but ultimately to help people know the love of Christ in their lives and to be formed and shaped and live their lives according to that love. Okay, so if we think about that's everything we do is to help that happen. That is true as a pastor too, and so at a kind of meta level, if you will, I'm all about doing that very thing that I was trying to do as a pastor. I just get to do it in a platform, if you will, that gets to help churches, nonprofits, leaders do that work. And so I'm still about that same purpose. So I would say that's one through line. And then the other is just in terms of the kinds of gifts and skills that you develop in pastoral ministry and through theological education and leading a team translates every day. I'm really trying to help a team be focused on that mission and purpose. I'm trying to help people be formed on our team. I'm trying to build community. I problem solve a lot. The kinds of things, the skills and things that you learn, and help co-create vision and possibility for the future with the leadership team. So.
And what would you say would be the single biggest discontinuity?
Okay.
That would be, when you're a minister, you're on call 24/7, so maybe you freed yourself from that.
I have.
Yeah.
Intentionally. In other words, I could do my job 24/7, but I think intentional about drawing some different boundaries. There's so many things about the life of a church that as a pastor, you get to be a part of the rhythms of families and people's lives in a very different way than when you run an organization. And and what it means to help people flourish, help form people in discipleship, what it means to follow the rhythms of the Christian year and to get to do that in worship, and there's this creative expression, and so yeah, I mean that's not my life right now.
Yeah, no, I do think if you're serving a local community, you're with people at the most critical moments of their lives, at births, at weddings, at funerals, crises of all sorts,
Right.
and you build a bond that you can't build any other way.
It's holy and it's tender, and there's nothing like it. Yeah.
So tonight, you lead a foundation committed to serving churches and helping to build leadership in communities. I try to lead a school that's doing the same thing. We're serving a common purpose. But we live in a world where religion is somewhat under siege. On Tuesday night, we had a major lecture, the Parks King lecture, and a guest came up to me afterwards and said, well, I think all Christian churches are just disappearing. And I said, well, I don't happen to agree with you, but he agreed we would meet and talk. So tonight, ostensibly, we're talking about this very issue, does organized religion still matter, as the technical theme? But think about that in light of your position, and what do you see as the major challenges, and what are the things that you can do from where you're at to try to make a difference?
Okay, those are big questions.
Yes, they are. Yeah. We didn't invite you here to ask little tiny things that we could already answer.
Right. So I mean, we have intentionally asked a provocative question. And I want to separate out how we think about organized religion and how we think about the purpose or the mission of the church. Because I do think there are a lot of problems with organized religion, the structures, the systems that we have put in place to be the church that maybe worked 50, 70 years ago and is less appealing today. And if folks are finding it less appealing and it is no longer thriving and vibrant, and there are examples of it. I attend a vibrant, thriving church that I love, but overall, if folks are seeking meaning, purpose, belonging, and the transcendent, and they're seeking it outside the church, the organized religion church, the inherited model church, then something's not right. There's a disconnect. And so I want to separate the question about organized religion and whether there's still something that matters about the purpose of religion that organized religion holds. Because I think it's more important and people are more sort of hungry and seeking and finding creative ways to engage belonging, community, meaning, purpose, justice, hope than ever before. So I think it absolutely still matters, and I think we have to take a really hard look at some of the institutional structures that exist that are getting in the way of actually living out the mission.
So I
don't know that I got to your question.
Well, we'll dig down
layered.
a little.
Okay.
Let's follow it with some other questions. So let's start like this. TMF has a lot of different aspects to it,
Yes.
and you serve different groups and different purposes. What are the trends that you observe from on top, looking out, at TMF? And maybe you can distinguish between those that TMF chooses and those that come from without? In other words, you make choices about funding, but what do you hear from people
Sure.
who talk to you and say, would you consider this?
Sure. And I would say a significant part of our work is this learning and innovation, which means we're paying attention to the religious landscape and maybe more specifically the Christian religious landscape, and we're constantly watching these trends and then trying to help leaders in the church think about what that means for them. And so there are some specific trends that we're watching, including this this emergence that's happening outside of the inherited model of church. So one of the ways I talk about it is that we have put all our eggs, our faith development, Christian discipleship, all our eggs in the basket of the inherited model, largely the attractional model of the church. And that leaves us, if you think about the ecosystem, the religious ecosystem, it leaves us with a lack of biodiversity. And an ecosystem cannot thrive with a lack of biodiversity. And so what's happening is there's this emergence of faith communities and other sort of ways that people are finding community, they're finding their faith, they're developing, they're being formed in online space, in coffee shops and breweries and house churches, all kinds of other ways. So one of the trends we're seeing is what's emerging outside of the inherited model. Now, what I want to be very clear to say is a diverse ecosystem means, and a biodiversity means you need both. You need the inherited model, and folks are going to continue to want to go to sacred and holy spaces and experience the transcendence in sanctuary, with stained glass and, organ music or whatever's their heart music, but that kind of biodiversity of all different sorts of faith expressions is one of the things that we're watching and paying attention to. Another is just how important it is right now to think about our neighborhoods as the unit of change. And I think somehow we've gotten it in our minds that churches are the unit of change, and therefore we ought to go and serve our neighbors. What does it mean to say the church is an agent of change, but the neighborhood is the place, the context? And so what does it mean to not just serve our neighbors, but to be a neighbor? And this neighboring movement transcends sort of disciplines of education and healthcare and religion and city planning. And so if we can work together and partner in a way that says neighborhoods are the unit of change, then perhaps human flourishing could be more the focus than getting people into our doors so that we can keep our doors open and pay our bills. Does that make sense? Like there's a flip there. And I think that is an emerging trend that folks are, I have more, but I
Yeah, well, so let me ask two things. One, my first reaction is this works well when you have a neighborhood which is actually a neighborhood.
Right, right.
But there are lots of places where people don't have a clue who their neighbor who lives next door is.
Yeah.
And so I like to tell the story. My wife lived in a state not far from here, just say New England, for many, many years. And when we got married, she came to Indiana. And one night at dinner, she said to me, "Why is it that when I go through the grocery store, everyone says hello to me when they don't know who I am?" And I said, "Because you're in the Midwest, you're no longer the East Coast." Connecticut, you might get a hello, but there are some states where you're probably not if they don't know who you are. And it was a different culture.
Yes.
And we did know our neighbors, but you don't necessarily know your neighbors in every neighborhood.
Right.
So, I mean, that can be a little bit of a challenge.
Yeah.
Let me start there with that question, but I have a follow-up.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so I do think that every church has to figure out what their context is. And so if they're a regional church, they may be working with city leaders. If you're a large regional church and you're not a neighborhood church, you're not literally talking about who's next door because you've got the businesses that are next door, and you have to go a ways to get to actual houses, then you really have to think about and define your neighborhood. And I bet there are schools in that neighborhood, and I bet you've got all kinds of issues in city planning, and you've got some unhoused neighbors in that mix, and you've got, so who are your neighbors, and what does it mean to be a neighbor? And that might mean partnerships with other churches, and it might mean thinking of, working with your, civic leaders. And so I do think it's about defining your context and what neighbor means.
So one of the things I very much appreciate that you've done at TMF is you started a program, and I think this is with the Wesleyan Partners, that you've made it a little bit broader, that constitutes the Tom Locke Entrepreneurial Leaders.
Yes, yes.
Can you tell
Sure.
everyone a little bit about that? But I'd be particularly interested if you could highlight one or two stories that illustrate what you've just said.
Absolutely. So this is the Tom Locke Innovative Leader Award. And I'll back up a little bit and say at Wesleyan Impact Partners, which is this national entity, we do similar things. But this Wesleyan Impact Partners board made the decision, given this sort of shift in the ecosystem, made the decision to help create an environment in which spiritual entrepreneurship could flourish, realizing that all our denominational systems and such support leaders for the inherited model church, but when you do something that's a little different, it's just hard to find support, and it's hard to take that entrepreneurial path. And so we decided we weren't talking infrastructure, because we would pretty quickly get down the denominational path, because that's what we know. And so we said, how do we create an environment? Well, using some of the work of Margaret Wheatley and Deborah Fries and the two-loop theory, which I won't go all into, but just to say that they talk about the fact that you can support innovation by spotlighting the innovators and networking them, and then they will organize for change. You don't have to direct the change, you just spotlight and network the leaders. And so a group of us at TMF, a small group under Tom Locke's leadership, which is why ultimately we named it for him, said, I think this is the work we can do, and that is to spotlight some of these innovators who are doing some of this out of the box, if you will, ministry, and then put them in a cohort, or invite them into a cohort is what I would say, that's got incredible facilitation. So we now have, as of this year, as of last month, named the new 2026. So we have named 26 awardees, and they get a cash prize. And because we know when you take an entrepreneurial path, you make sacrifices, your family makes sacrifices, and it's to the individual, so they have tax implications. And then we invite them into the cohort, and they say that's the most amazing part of the whole experience, is that they get to be with colleagues they didn't even know existed, and they're like, oh, I feel so seen, these are my people, this is, so that's been an incredible experience, and we've learned so much from it and grown. So I'll give a couple of examples. One of these entrepreneurial leaders is actually an attorney who moved his practice into, his pastor actually invited him to move his practice into the church where he was attending, Methodist church, where he was attending in Chicago. And so he worked with, he called himself, instead of a criminal defense attorney working with teenage and young adult men in the community, he called himself a community defense attorney. So he was for them and he was for the community. And so every one of them that would come to see him in his office would have to come into the church, which is pretty cool, I thought, to this sort of sacred space, and he would handle them and their case with such care. But he also worked with other community leaders to create a safe space. They used hip-hop music, they call it circles and ciphers, and create community with some of these teens and young adults in the community to share their creativity, to share their lives with each other. And it was a sharing space, literally in the circle, but also using music and creativity to do. So that's one example of a non-pastor one who's creating really essentially a faith-based community. And then another is, there's so many I could share. One we'll take a closer look at tomorrow, actually, is a pastor in Galveston, and was appointed to this church, and a big building that used to worship hundreds and now was worshiping 4, and they were all over 80, and they were on this ride with him, and they have identified their neighbors, many of whom were unhoused on Galveston Island and in Galveston County, and they are now the largest provider of services to the unhoused community in Galveston County.
Wow.
And it is all led through partnerships, including the medical school and other churches and neighbors, but mostly it is run and given life by the unhoused neighbors themselves. And there's a whole story there, but it's very cool.
Yeah.
So there's
and
a
these
couple of
stories
examples.
are online. Yeah. So people, if you're interested in learning and seeing more of these stories, you can go to the
WesleyanImpactPartners.org.
Yeah. And you'll see that. So it's really impressive. I've met a couple of them. They're very impressive. When you think about infrastructure for all of these moves, so you've given some examples of partnerships. But what do you see as the real challenges, when someone's trying to launch what we used to call parachurch organization or something like that? How do you think about it? Is it through partnerships? That's how you build the infrastructure? Do you have advice to people about how they should think about the way they might be able to make this more than just a great idea that they have, but to bring it into reality?
Yeah. So one of the really, I think, critical things that we've learned through this is that some of us who are deeply connected to denominations or other institutional structures can't do guesswork on what is needed. It really has to come from the innovators themselves. And so a few things they've said, they need and want partners who are connected to the institutional church, both in terms of the resources, the financial resources, but even more than that, there are connectional systems and resources that are very, including people and people who know people and people who have expertise that can help some of these innovators launch ministries. So those kinds of partnerships are really important, but very much guided by the innovators themselves. The other thing over and over and over again is they are spiritual leaders and they want to be formed spiritually and they want ongoing formation. And so, places where they continue to be formed spiritually. Mentors, peers, places where they can be in relationship with other innovators is really important. It's a very lonely thing to be an entrepreneur. And so these are the things we're hearing from them. Yeah.
So I'd be very curious. I want to come back and come full circle now. So you were a minister and served a number of churches. You had holy frustration.
Yeah,
I think
holy discontent.
Holy discontent, sorry. Holy discontent.
Frustration works too.
Yeah, and moved into a different form of ministry. But you still attend a church.
I do.
And described it as vibrant. So what would you like to say to the churches, the established churches, denominations, or at least whether they're recognized as denominations or large community churches?
Yeah.
What would you say to them from your vantage point? What do you think is important for people to hear in a world when there's so much uncertainty about the future?
Yeah. So one thing I would say is I really do believe that denominations are needed, and I'm using denominations as kind of a general term for systems that connect and resource churches, and so I realize that covers a wide range of how connected and how congregational, and so I'm wanting that in sort of the broadest placeholder way to talk about it, but needed to be a container for sort of values and theological depth and covenant and accountability, and I really think there's something there that is very valuable. I think we've turned it into gosh, I cannot say this concisely. In other words, my list is long of what I want to say to.
Okay.
I do think that there's deep value, and I'm so grateful, and I don't want the church to give up on what it means to be connected to a theological system that we believe in, and to resource leaders. I just think we've gotten a little heavy-handed with it, and maybe too centralized. The local context matters so much that the more we can equip leaders to be engaged locally and equip local churches to be engaged locally, I think the better we're going to be. But we formed some centralized systems in a time of convergence in our country and a time of affiliation, and those systems are not serving us as well today.
Yeah, so we all recognize that our society has much stronger centrifugal forces than centripetal forces. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think that's also perceived in churches as well. Mm-hmm. That's what I hear you saying. How do you think, what would you say to people who will lead communities of faith? How do they avoid falling into the trap of polarization, if I can call it that? I mean, there are moral values that we need to uphold, and we shouldn't apologize for them. But we also don't need to simply be political entities. That's a mistake, at least in my mind. So what would you say to help people avoid that trap?
So if we're particularly talking about political polarization and some of that, I think Brueggemann had really good advice for us as preachers. We sometimes, pull the gospel under our arm and if you think of the three entities in the preaching experience, it's the preacher and the gospel and the people, and we sometimes pull that gospel under our arm and then try to convict the people or tell them the way or whatever. And Brueggemann says that really it's about letting the gospel convict us all, right? And so there is a role of the preacher to let the gospel speak and to be a voice for that. And by gospel, I don't just mean the New Testament, but the good news, you know. And I think the voice of the church, the voice of the gospel, the voice of love is needed more than ever, wherever you find yourself politically. So I think that's the work of the church. Now,
Okay.
It sounds a little idealistic, so I get that. But if we, but I just think Jesus has a good word for us today.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, are you sanguine about the future given what you see with these different forms of communities that are being developed? Or are you pessimistic? I mean, we all know the Pew polls. We all know the polls that sociologists of religion take, and
Yeah.
now it seems to be a little more hopeful at present, at least the last Pew poll. But what about you? What's your read, and how do you think of the future of religion? Let's say primarily in the U.S. You can comment on other parts of the world if you want, but let's try the U.S.
Yeah, we'll stick to U.S. So I'm hopeful. I'm very hopeful. And what makes me hopeful is that this feels like an unfrozen time. When a people or an organization or a culture is stuck or frozen, then there isn't movement. There isn't the kind of freedom to do something different. And I think because of rapid change, because of, just so many things that are happening in our culture, it is an unfrozen time. And it's a time when creativity can happen and innovation, and folks are hungry for it and need it, and that's a hopeful time for the gospel to do its work.
Yeah.
The Holy Spirit is very much alive and doing incredible things. And so if we can pay attention to that and be part of it, then I think.
I always think a challenge is an opportunity.
Yeah.
And I hope we can think of it that way.
Yeah.
So let me come now to your alma mater. So from where you sit, so this is a chance for you to be very direct and candid. But what do you see, what should the role of a school like this, and there are others like us, some in the state where you now reside and others, what should we be doing to try to help train people both for the established churches, if I can use that phrase, but also help them think about ways that are creative, that will serve a broader sphere of people?
Yeah.
You guys don't quarterback to me on Monday, please.
I really want to ask you this question too. So you just be thinking, because I think you ought to speak into this as well. But I do think this is a moment where we have to be thinking differently about the role of theological education. I think some of the core elements are going to continue to be core elements. Biblical and theological training and how we think theologically. So I continue to think that's the core. But I think the professionalization of clergy, that's sort of the only path of what it means to lead a faith community is in an inherited model church with a theological degree and a whole system of credentialing for that church that once existed. And I'm not saying there won't still be ordained folks with, MDivs. I'm not saying that there won't be, but we've made that kind of the path that's accepted. And I think we've got to think about different ways of leading. We've got to open up our mind about what it means to lead faith communities and bi and multi-vocational ministries. And we've got to train for entrepreneurial leadership. Most of us were not trained in entrepreneurial leadership. And I don't mean that everybody has to be an entrepreneur. I don't mean that, because that's a kind of a DNA thing in a way. But I do think there are some aspects of entrepreneurial leadership that are critical for the church and for the future. And I think access is big. And you and I have talked about this before. Yeah. Access is big. It's really important. And so whereas theological education has been really all about training clergy for local church ministry, it's got to be about training people, many of whom are going to remain lay, rightly, for the leading of the church's mission, right? So I think you're thinking about all of these things,
yeah.
Greg. I mean, these are conversations we have had. But I'm curious what you are thinking about what needs to change about theological education.
So I stepped down. I was leading a small foundation for PhD scholarships for PhD students. And when I stepped down, they said, would you give us an address on the state of theological education? So here's the thumbnail sketch.
Okay.
So in this country, originally there were the people who were the established churches, meaning supported by the state. And that in the state of Connecticut went till 1818. So they were paying for congregational ministers. Mm-hmm. They were paying their salaries. They were helping to pay for Yale College. First the colony, you have to remember that Yale's older than the United States, first the colony, and then the state of Connecticut. Well, in 1818, after the separation of church and state, Jefferson won that argument, and I'm grateful he did, but it created a crisis because all of a sudden, all these people, Jefferson supported the Baptists and the Methodists who weren't the established churches because they politically supported him. The other side, like John Adams, lost, all right? And that created a real crisis. Mm-hmm. How are we going to be paid? Mm-hmm. So you had the development of the professional education model. That's when all of these schools started to come into existence. So this school, 1822, is when we came into existence as a separate unit within Yale. Andover Newton was the first. And I like to mark the boundaries of what I call professional education from when they started in 1807 to when they joined us, marking the end of that whole period because things have changed so much. And so I think right now, we're in what I call the Nepantla of theological education. That's a Mesoamerican word which means I know where I was or where we've come from, but I don't really have a clue where we're headed. Yeah. And I'm trying to figure it out. It literally means in betweenness. There's actually a journal called Nepantla. And so I think your comment about forming people and giving them the skills they need is really important, but doing it broadly. Mm-hmm. And you're here in part, this transformative leadership program is in part an effort to engage in this very thing, to bring very talented people in who've done things outside the normal boundaries, and for them to hear your stories and also to see it's really possible to do this. Yeah. You can be successful. You can make a difference in your lives. And I always find it inspiring to be around people like you. So that's why you're here. So that's in a nutshell my answer, but I largely agree with you. I want to ask one last question, and then we're going to open this up to questions from the floor. But when I finish an interview with a prospective faculty member or a senior staff member, I always ask them something like, imagine 30 years from now, it depends on their age, 40 years from now, and you're being honored at a retirement dinner party. What do you want them to say about you? The kind of like the long view back. So think about this conversation and project it out 30 years if you can. What would you like for people to be saying about the topic we've been discussing tonight and the state of religion today? How would you like them then? What kinds of questions should they be asking at that point if we do things well now?
I would love it if people see organized religion as a place that is permission-giving and directs resources toward, equity and innovation, and, instead of sort of holding, save and protect, they're really investing in, and that organized religion is seen that way. It's seen like as a place where that is nurturing a sort of diverse ecosystem, if you will, of the religious landscape. Because I think there's a separation there. I think there's a feeling like organized religion invests in itself, and there's a need for what is emerging to, so I would love it if, 20, 30 years from now, that conversation has changed, and it's seen as like, do you remember when it started investing? And I mean that in sort of all the ways, financial and people and resources and goodness, and how it changed the whole landscape,
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I've asked you lots of questions. We need to give the audience a chance. I have two requests. Some of you, Lisa, will know from the class, but would you go ahead and identify yourself in case she doesn't remember your name badge on the desk where you were sitting? And also make sure your question is actually a question, not a long comment, as I like to say. And so who would like to pose a question? Please. And then up here in the front, yes.
Hi, I'm Nora Elizabeth, she, her pronouns. And I'm thinking about imagining a different way of doing institutional religion. And I'm also thinking about the Parks King lecture where Reverend Dr. Anne-Marie Mingo was talking about imagination as a muscle. And so I'm wondering how we can encourage people in local churches that are very used to a certain way of doing things to begin exercising this muscle of imagination to then begin to imagine something different.
Oh, this is so good, and you're right in the place that I love to talk about, because mostly learn about, because I think we're all on this journey of trying to expand our imaginations. And we have a podcast called Igniting Imagination, and we often say it's not just the name of our podcast, it's our theory of change. Because I think you're spot on. I think that I think it was Friedman who said we're in a gridlock of imagination, and what we need is to ignite imagination or expand our imagination for what's possible. And so you asked a very specific, okay, how do we do this right now? And I don't think there's an easy answer to that, but I do think there are some things we can do. I think we are used to kind of silencing dissenting voices, but dissenting voices can actually help us ask a new question. Why did we start that way? Why doing that thing? Why, So welcoming dissenting voices, diverse voices, really important. I think learning journeys where we take leaders and we take them to other neighborhoods or other places and we learn from folks who are doing creative things can be superb in terms of igniting imagination for what's possible, especially if you're meeting with folks that are maybe engaging their neighborhood, but they're not at a church. And so you just kind of get out of your mind of the church and learn from folks in different disciplines, whether that's, again, healthcare or education or community centers or artists or, fill in the blank. But just a couple of ideas. Yeah. Thanks, Nora Elizabeth.
Hello, my name is Lita, and I'm really interested in the sort of messy, sticky part of your work in finances, because I think that that's so tricky for churches, especially thinking through what can be a very unethical sector, I would say. And I'm really interested in, I've done a lot of work with groups that are looking at the finances of groups that have endowments and saying that the investments that they're making in, 40 years ago in apartheid South Africa, more recently in fossil fuels and weapons manufacturers, that those things are unethical or contrary to the mission of the church. And for example, in my own tradition in the UCC, when we called on some of our fiduciary bodies to divest from fossil fuels several years ago, the answer that we got was that that was not feasible, or it wasn't, it would violate their fiduciary trust because the money that is made through the investments in the companies furthers the work of the church, and it would somehow be a loss if they divested. And I know that's a really live topic right now. Even here at YDS, we're talking about this a lot. So I'm curious if that's a conversation that you're having and kind of what your thoughts on those sorts of issues are.
Yeah. Boy, okay, we could do an entire, a whole other seminar. Yeah. And, right. What I can say is I do think that our theology, our ethics have to permeate our processes too. So I do think it's worth asking the questions. We're not an investment manager, we have an investment manager. And we are in those conversations and with churches. One of the things that we love about inviting folks to invest with us, and one of our tools in our loan fund is that every bit of those dollars go to churches and nonprofits that are, those dollars get lent to churches and nonprofits who are doing great ministry. So we say, why wouldn't you invest with us? This is a great. So it's a shorter answer to a longer conversation, but to say, I do think it's worth asking the questions and knowing that that there's all kinds of tension when we are unwinding years and years of practices. And so that has to do with fossil fuels, but it also has to do with so many other things that we've taken for granted and not ever questioned. And so, it's worth deep theological and relational sort of conversation around those things.
Back, I see two hands in the back.
Hey, my name is Mike Ryan.
Hi, Mike.
I was wondering what might be some pitfalls you foresee organized religion having as they're looking forward to the future?
Yeah. So when we're talking about, most of my experiences with the mainline church, so I'm going to speak there, but to say we're hesitant to have the conversations we need to have. So significant pitfall is, so let's just take an example of, we've been in this building for 50, 80, 100 years, pick your number, we love it, and it's got all this deferred maintenance. We're using half the building we used to be using, fill in the blanks, we know the story. And and we're not having the conversation. We're just not even having the conversation. And we need to be thinking about this amazing asset we have and how we're using it for the sake of human flourishing and thriving. And so whatever repurposing needs to happen or whatever. So that's just an example, but I think a big pitfall is we're not having the hard conversations we need to have. And I think getting out of the comfort places, though we've always done it, so that igniting imagination, for what could be, is a big one. We have got to actually actively destabilize the systems that are not working. And we don't want to do that. We don't want to destabilize systems. We want to build, and destabilizing is hard, and it has to happen if we're going to really make way for what is to come. And those systems that are keeping us from being what it is we need to be. So, I don't know. Those are a few. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
My name is Lucas, current student. Thank you for your talk. I'm wondering to what extent your work in TMF contribute or going towards how you measure impact in terms of regenerating the church not in terms of institution, but in terms of the people of God. Mm-hmm. And the reason I'm asking this question is because I'm glad to hear that TMF is doing a lot of work in terms of innovation, entrepreneurship, and somewhat like being an incubator for this wonderful individuals. And I think that's great in terms of church as an institution. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I'm looking at the UMC church that is shrinking in terms of population or the number, as well as, last time I checked, only 10% of the UMC membership is between the age of 18 and 29. Mm-hmm. So if pulling into 50 years from now, if the TMF is successful in making a lot of these grants and making the church as an institution of dispensing wonderful social innovation, but there's no body in the UMC church, I feel that's somewhat discordant. So or is it based on your mission? Yeah. And then if it's discordant, then to what extent do you measure the work of your organization also contributing back to growing the body of Christ inside the UMC, for example?
Right. So, one of the things that you've just gotten to the heart of how hard it is to do it, to work with churches and try to build purpose, generosity, and courage, how do you measure that? I mean, you can measure some things that are proxy variables, and we in the church have long been using the proxy variable of attendance at Sunday worship or weekend worship experience as a proxy for deepening your faith, because we're not sure how to measure deepening faith. And generosity or giving as another proxy for, where your treasure is, there your heart is. So it's a pretty decent measure there, says Jesus. So, but those may not be the full measure of what's happening in terms of building the body of Christ, helping people grow in their faith, formation, building community. So what are the other measures that we can, and I would say this is an ongoing conversation. I mean, we're struggling to figure out how do we measure these emerging sort of faith communities when they're not a member of a church? Is that effort part of the body of Christ? And if it's out of a local church that's growing this initiative, say through a Fresh Expressions movement or something like that, does it count toward the little sheet that you fill out every year and turn into your denominational judicatory body? I mean, and so those measures are, you've asked a question that's really critical, and that is, how are we measuring our impact? And how do we know if it's really making a difference? If we're making disciples, if people are being formed in faith, if they're making a difference in their community, you know, and so I do think we have to do some more holistic measures. If we're deeply engaged in our neighborhood and there's people are keeping their jobs longer and there's better health and some of the measures you can, has the church been a part of that and has it made a difference? You know, maybe that becomes part of the bigger picture of how that local congregation measures impact. For us as an institution, as an organization, we've engaged some folks who are helping us think about narrative assessment of impact and how we can, if we can't count it, can we measure it through the input we're getting from the folks who have been engaged in our ministries. So there's a whole theory around that and a whole methodology that we're learning a lot about. But I think we've got to change from just counting to really thinking about, to looking at how are we measuring impact. And I don't think anybody's got that figured out, but if you know we've just got little inklings of it here and there.
So there are two things left. One, I think there's some refreshments that people would like to stay and visit with one another, and maybe Lisa would be kind enough to stay just for a little while. Her husband is here with her too, Joe. So just raise your hand there. So we're very grateful that he accompanied her. And now our second thing is, I hope you realize the road she's traveled from when she sat right where you're sitting, and I mean that literally, to where she's at now, and you still hear the passion and the desire to make a difference in this world through her life. That's what we hope all of us will do. Would you join me in thanking her for her life's work and for her time with us tonight?